Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today we will be discussing the main theme of the March LAP issue, Freeing Latin America from Mistaken Theses, Homage to Rodolfo Stavenhagen, with editors Jan Russ and Arturo Alvarado. Jan Russ is a research professor at the Centro de Estudios Superiores de México y Centroamérica in San Cristobal de la Casa, Chiapas, Mexico, and a coordinating editor for Latin American Perspectives. Arturo Alvarado is director of the Centro de Estudios Sociológicos at the Colegio de México and author of Vidas Trucadas, El exceso de homicidios en la juventud de América Latina, 1999 through 2010. Good morning, Jan and Arturo. It's a pleasure to have you both here with us today.
Good morning.
Talk to you.
So to start off, Jan, I was wondering if you could briefly summarize for our readers the theme of the March issue.
Well, the issue comes out of a seminar that was held in Mexico City to celebrate the 50th anniversary of a really groundbreaking essay by Rodolfo Stavenhagen from 1965. The title of the essay is 7 Erroneous Theses about Latin America. And in the essay, Stavenhagen takes a number of ideas from modernization theory, which was the basis of development policies in Latin America in the mid-1960s, and explains why they're mistaken. Probably the best one to explain this is Arturo.
Okay, thank you. I'll jump into this issue because the idea was, when we started developing the idea of the seminar together with Rodolfo, was to answer a simple question, whether or not the manuscripts he developed 50 years ago was still valid and was still useful to understand what was happening or what has happened to Latin America in the last 50 years with these ideas about development. And what we were trying to discuss together with Rodolfo at that moment is how to take into consideration new issues of development by retaking parts of his 7 theses and also by rediscussing the background, the intellectual, the philosophical, and the political background of the idea of the 7 theses. On the one hand, he was starting to try to set up a critical idea of the notion and the paradigms of development for Latin America. Second, by talking about 7 theses, he was also bringing up into the discussion what Mariátegui was discussing in the late 30s about the 7 theses for Latin America.
I guess I can add something to that. I'm an anthropologist, and Rodolfo Stavenhagen at the beginning of his career was also an anthropologist. The theory of development for indigenous people all over Latin America came from the notion that indigenous people were somehow backward and were separate from the countries that they lived in. That's actually one of the mistaken theses. So the way to develop indigenous people, indigenous areas, was to force indigenous people to speak the national languages and to supposedly gradually increase them and introduce them into the national culture. And Stavenhagen, from his experience as a very young man, saw that that was a mistake, that people who were deemed to be outside of the national cultures, in fact, worked on plantations in the places he first went. And then later on, when he got to the Andes and got to other parts of Latin America, he saw that everywhere indigenous people were not separate. They were part of the national economies. And from that, and from dependency theory, he developed the idea that people aren't poor and aren't stuck at somehow a lower level of development because they're not participants. They're stuck in those places precisely because they are participants. It's the way capitalism has developed that in fact has locked people into dependent positions. And by the 1960s, that was being called, in the mid-1960s, that was being called, in the case of Mexico, internal colonialism, that people in regions of Mexico that were less developed had been locked into a colonial position early in Mexico's history as a country and hadn't been able to get out of that position. And with Latin America's position with respect to the developed countries, Latin America had been locked into the position of being a supplier of raw materials from which it could never become a developed, wealthy country. So what Rodolfo Stavenhagen did was he pointed out that Latin American Indian communities and Latin American indigenous regions were not separate, that their poverty was not a result of their cultural difference. It was a result of economic exploitation and political oppression. And that changes the way we look at the way anthropologists work. It changes the way people work all over Latin America in all levels of society. Instead of taking Latin American societies in pieces, since Stavenhagen's time and since dependency theory, we look at economies as wholes, and that the places that people are in those economies as places in those economies, not as separate little microcosms.
So, considering the significance of Rodolfo Stavenhagen's ideas to how we understand inequality and development in Latin America, Jan or Arturo, could you discuss how Stavenhagen's work continues to inform how contemporary scholars like yourselves and researchers, or also maybe political organizers or social movement organizers, approach these issues?
In the case of the part of Mexico where I work, through the 1950s and really into the 1970s, what scholars studied was the way communities were organized inside of themselves, the way they were considered separate little worlds. And what Rodolfo Stavenhagen did was he came along and said, no, look again at those little communities. They're not self-sufficient communities of little farmers. Those people are plantation workers. And when we started looking, sure enough, that's what we found. And so, of course, that has profound implications for what you do to try to equalize things economically. No longer are you trying to just force people into the economy. They're already in the economy. And in anthropology, all over Latin America, after Stavenhagen, and some of the people who were writing at the same time as Stavenhagen, especially in Mexico and Peru, all of us study indigenous people not just as people with a separate culture, but as poor people, as people who are put upon in societies of which they're part. Rodolfo Stavenhagen was the first one to call indigenous regions in Latin America analogous to homelands in Africa. And so in my field, in anthropology, I think it can be said fairly that Rodolfo Stavenhagen is the beginning of the modern era of Latin American anthropology. Now, this conference was about the way things have changed. And all of the countries are bigger. The rural societies are relatively smaller. The place that I work in, Mexico, all indigenous people were only in the countryside in the 1960s, and now half of them live in cities. So this conference in Mexico City about Rodolfo Stavenhagen's work was about all the changes that have accumulated in 50 years and whether the original insights of 1965 are still applicable and to what point they're applicable. And I think probably Arturo can speak better to that last question than I can.
Well, what I can say is that the Rodolfo Stavenhagen thinking, goes beyond anthropology. To begin with, he was trying to set up a discussion that was not based on an only disciplinary field, but that will cover several disciplinary fields by discussing the issue of modernization. And what we saw at the conference is that economists, historians, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists came up together trying to retake certain parts of certain theses or the whole thesis as an overall proposal for development and for critical development of Latin America. And what we saw is that some people consider that parts of the thinking that he structured at that moment are still useful to understand issues of development, like rural or agrarian development. Also, some issues about in late industrializations, other issues about integration of middle classes and the political development of certain political positions in Latin America. But overall, I think that what the conference, provide us is an overall idea of what was the impact of the 7 theses and how much of this impact of the 7 theses are still valid to understand and explain the issues of development or underdevelopment, exclusion in Latin America. And with that, going beyond the point and following what Jan was saying, there are more important issues today about, for instance, rural development that came up with the conference and with other discussions. They were not separated. These communities were not only this idea of traditional separated autonomous communities. They were all together since the beginning of the development of capitalism. And also today, this is a crucial issue because most of the most important mega projects or major development projects in Latin America from major international and transnational corporations, and making more clear and putting more evidence that this divide between the modern and the traditional was not more than an artifact of the idea of modernization. It's a real situation where underground classes, peoples and indigenous peoples and rural classes are still exploited systematically by these overall major mega projects. The second issue that is interesting, and it was not clear at the moment of the writing or the draft of the seventh thesis, is that there are issues about not only rural communities, there are issues about indigenous peoples and minorities that were just coming up to be part of the discussion in the late 80s and 90s for critical social thinkers. That was not the main issue at the moment of the seventh thesis because, for instance, as you remember, because of these common, Marxist ideas about campesinos, peasant societies, they were undercovering all the difference between peasant societies. And one major issue was the class issue that Rodolfo was trying to set up with the seventh thesis, making up this idea that there are also classes inside the rural societies, and the indigenous peoples are also part of this integration process into the capitalist societies. No? So all of these issues and probably some other topics about theoretical consequences of the seventh thesis came up in the discussion during the conference.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you, Jan and Arturo, providing us with such insight into the dynamic landscape in Latin America. That is all the time we have for today, but thank you for listening in. Please don't forget to add us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube, and all of our other wonderful social media sites. Hasta luego!